So Nehemiah was called to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem around 450 BC. This story, I think, serves as a great picture and example and model of church planting, even though he built a wall. I'm going to read the first few verses and parts of the first couple chapters as an example. So here is the first part of Nehemiah 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hilkiah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And so the starting point of Nehemiah's vision is that he identifies with people's brokenness, is that Nehemiah sees that there's great trouble and disgrace for God's people. The walls are broken down, the gates are burned by fire, and so he literally weeps for the brokenness of the city walls and the brokenness of God's people, because those broken down walls meant that the Jewish exiles in Jerusalem were defenseless against their enemies, and the walls could be breached at any time. And so his response is to sit down and weep. And so really the seeds of vision oftentimes are connecting with the brokenness of the people and of the city. It's really similar to Jesus' reaction when he looked on the people of Israel in Matthew 9. It says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Okay? And so that's kind of his first response, is to identify with the brokenness. Then that second part says this. Again, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my ancestral family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. And so I love how Nehemiah, again, responds with mourning, fasting, and prayer. In other words, the vision for renewal begins with lamenting what is not God's will. And Nehemiah knows this, and it's so shameful to think that God's people are so despairing at this point in time. And he kind of lets that sink in, and he even identifies with them and confesses his own part in that we as planters aren't above the problems that our cities and the problems that lost people face. We're part of that problem. And so this confession is this wonderful, humble way to begin. So that's how Nehemiah starts out. And then he goes on in his prayer, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1. Remember the instruction. He's telling God to remember. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. And so Nehemiah, in this prayer, he remembers and recalls God's promises, right? He goes back to the law of Moses. He brings it to mind. He remembers the promise God made in Deuteronomy 30, where he said he would regather his people out of exile and bring them to a place of his own choosing. So he says, this is your desire and your heart and your will. This is what you're going to do ultimately, God. And then, given that reality, he looks for an opportunity to respond and to bring resources. So here's what happens when he's the next time he's around the king. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. Pretty perceptive on the king's part. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, kind of shoots up a little arrow prayer. I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, here's his audacity, he says, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. And so when the opportunity arises, Nehemiah makes the big ask of the king. He's like, here's all the things that I need in order to fulfill this vision that God has placed on my heart. And amazingly, the king says, yes, here are the letters you need to travel safely. Here's the timber you need to rebuild the walls. And so Nehemiah is not afraid to make the big ask, and neither should we either. So God provides in amazing ways. And so Nehemiah goes on his way, verse 11 of chapter 2. "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others," maybe his little core group, if you will. "I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews, or the priests, or nobles, or officials, or any others who would be doing the work." So what is this? Nehemiah does like a little reconnaissance mission so he can research the context and the need, right? He's scoping out the condition of the wall and the gates. It's kind of a secret mission at this point, so he knows what he's up against. So he's doing what we would call neighborhood exegesis. What are the needs in the neighborhood, and what's the solution? And then, so with all that in hand, he's got some resources, he knows the context and the need, and then, and this is when he says to the people, verse 17, "Then I said to the people, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. So it's amazing how he casts the vision, and they respond by saying, "We're with you, we're on board," and they start. And then last but not least, it's not such an easy story. What happens right after they begin the good work? Verse 19 says, "But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Gershom the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us." "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." There's going to be opposition. Some of it's going to be spiritual. Some of it's going to be practical. Some of it's going to be people who don't believe in what you're doing. And part of the clarity of vision is the ability to say back, you know what, God's in this, and we are going to do it. So Nehemiah, these first 2 chapters, I encourage you to reread them and really mine out all the gems in there that relate specifically to church planting.